The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 3, Side 1. Obligation was any compulsion by law to the performance of an act. It could arise by delict or by contract. Delicts or torts, non-contractual wrongs committed against a person or his property, were in many cases punished by an obligation to pay the injured person a sum of money in compensation. A contract was an agreement enforceable at law. It did not have to be written. Indeed, until the 2nd century A.D., the verbal agreement made by uttering the word spondeo, I promise, before a witness was considered more sacred than any written compact. The many witnesses and solemn ceremony once required for legal contract were no longer necessary. Business was quickened by the legal recognition of any clear agreement, usually entries made by the parties in their account books, or tabulae. But the law guarded transactions carefully. It warned the seller with a caveat venditor, as well as the buyer with a caveat emptor, against the myriad forms of cheating natural to civilized life. Any seller of slaves or cattle, for example, was required by law to disclose their physical defects to the purchaser, and was held accountable despite a plea of ignorance. Debt was contracted by loan, mortgage, deposit, or trust. Loans for consumption were usually secured by a mortgage on realty or movable goods. A default in principle entitled the mortgagee to take over the property. In early Republican law, as we have seen, such default permitted the lender to attach the person of the borrower as a bondsman. The Lex Poetalia of 326 B.C. modified this rule by allowing the debtor to work off his obligation while retaining his freedom. After Caesar, defaulted mortgages were usually satisfied by the sale of the debtor's property without jeopardy to his person. But cases of enslavement to a creditor occur as late as Justinian. Commercial defaults were mitigated by a law of bankruptcy, which sold the bankrupt's property to pay his debts, but permitted him to keep as much of his later acquisitions as his subsistence required. The chief crimes against property were damage, theft, and rapine, theft with violence. The 12 Tables had condemned a detected thief to be flogged and then delivered as a bondsman to his victim. If the thief was a slave, he was to be scourged and flung from the Tarpeian Rock. Increased social security permitted Praetorian law to soften these severities to a twofold, threefold, or fourfold restitution. In its final form, the law of property was the most perfect part of the Roman Code. 5. The law of procedure. Of all ancient peoples, the Romans were the most prone to litigation, despite the discouraging complexity, technicality, and confusing fictions of their procedural law. Doubtless our own legal actions would have seemed to them equally devious and prolonged. The older the civilization, the longer the lawsuits. Any man, as noted above, could make himself a prosecutor in a Roman court. In the patrician republic, the accuser, the defendant, and the magistrate were required to follow a form called legis actio, or process of law, and the slightest deviation invalidated the action. Thus, says Gaius, a man who sued another for cutting his vines, and in his action called them vines, lost his case because he should have called them trees, since the 12 Tables speak generally of trees and not particularly of vines. Each party deposited with the magistrate a sum of money, or sacramentum, which was forfeited by the losing party to the state religion. The defendant also had to give bail, or vademonium, as security for his subsequent appearances. The magistrate then turned over the dispute to a person on the list of those qualified to act as judges. In some cases, the judges issued an interim interdictum, requiring one or more of the parties in the case to perform or refrain from certain actions. If the defendant lost, his property, sometimes his person, could be seized by the plaintiff until the judgment was satisfied. About 150 B.C., the Lex Ibutia abolished the necessity of using this ritual legis actio, and accepted in its place a procedure per formulam. Specific acts and words were no longer required. The parties shared with the magistrate in determining the form under which the matter was to be submitted to the judge, and the magistrate then wrote to the judge an instruction, or formula, on the factual and legal questions involved. It was partly in this way that the praetor, as magistrate, made praetorian law. In the 2nd century A.D., a third mode of action, cognitio extraordinaria, came into use. The magistrate decided the case himself. By the end of the 3rd century, the formulary procedure had disappeared, and the summary judgment of a magistrate responsible only to the emperor, and usually owing his office to him, reflected the coming of absolute monarchy. The litigants could conduct their case, and the praetor or judge decide it without the help of lawyers if they wished. But as the iudex was not often a professional trained in the law, and the litigants might at every step stumble over a technicality, all parties to a dispute usually sought the aid of trial lawyers, or advocati, legal technicians, or pragmatici, consultants, or jurisconsulti, or jurists, or jurisprudentes. There was no lack of legal talent, for every fond parent yearned to see his son an advocate, and the law, then as now, was the vestibule to public office. A character in Petronius gives his son a collection of red-backed books, or codices, to learn a little law, as it spells money. A law student began by learning the elements from some private instructor. In his second stage, he attended the consultations of eminent jurists. Thereafter, he apprenticed himself to a practicing lawyer. Early in the 2nd century AD, certain jurisconsulti set up in various parts of Rome schools, or stationes, at which they gave instruction or advice in the law. Ammianus complains of their high fees, saying that they charged even for their yawns and made matricide venial if the client paid enough. These teachers were called juris civilis professores. Apparently the title of professor came from the fact that they were required by law to declare, or profiteri, their intention of teaching, and to secure a license therefor from the public authority. Out of the many lawyers so trained, there were inevitably some who sold their learning to sordid causes, accepted bribes to present their client's case weakly, found loopholes in the law for any crime, fomented disputes among rich men, dragged on suits to any lucrative length, and shook the courts or the forum with their intimidating questioning and their vituperative summations. Forced to compete for cases, some lawyers sought to build a reputation by walking hurriedly through the streets with bundles of documents in their hands, borrowed rings on their fingers, dependents attending them, and hired claqueurs to applaud their speech. So many ways had been found of circumventing the old Cincian law against fees that Claudius legalized them up to 10,000 sesterces per case. Any fee above this figure was to be recoverable by law. This restriction was easily evaded, for we hear of a lawyer in Vespasian's reign amassing a fortune of 300 million sesterces, or $30 million. As in every generation, there were attorneys and judges whose clear and disciplined minds were at the service of truth and justice regardless of fee, and the lowest practitioners were redeemed by the great jurists whose names are the highest in the history of the law. Courts for the trial of offenders varied from the hearings held by individual judges or magistrates to the assemblies, the Senate, and the Emperor. Instead of a single judge, the praetor might choose by lot, subject to a number of challenges by accuser and defendant, a jury of almost any size, usually 51 or 75, from the 850 senatorial or equestrian names on the jury list. 2 special courts were permanently maintained, the decemviri, or 10 men to try cases of civil status, and the centumviri, or 100 men to hear suits in property and bequest. The proceedings of these bodies were open to the public, for the younger Pliny describes the great crowd that came to hear him address the larger court. Juvenal and Apuleius complain of judicial procrastination and venality, but their very indignation suggests exceptional cases. Trials were marked by a freedom of speech and action seldom known in modern courts. Several lawyers might appear on each side, some specialized in preparing the evidence, some in presenting it. The proceedings were recorded by various clerks, notarii, actuarii, scribae, and were sometimes taken down in shorthand. Martial says of certain scribes, however fast the words may run, their hands are quicker still. Plutarch tells how stenographers took down the speeches of Cicero, often to his discomfort. Witnesses were dealt with according to time-honored precedents. Says the exemplary Quintilian, "In the examination of a witness, the first essential is to know his type. For a timid witness may be terrorized, a fool outwitted, an irascible man provoked, and vanity flattered. The shrewd and self-possessed witness must be dismissed at once as malicious and obstinate, or if his past life admits of criticism, his credit may be overthrown by the scandalous charges that can be brought against him." Almost any kind of argument might be made by the advocate. He could show the court pictures of the alleged crime, painted on wood or canvas. He could hold a child in his arms while arguing a point. He could bear the scars of an accused soldier or the wounds of a client. Defenses were contrived against these weapons. Quintilian tells how one attorney, when his opponent illustrated a summation by bringing his client's children into court, threw dice among them. The children scrambled for the tesserae and ruined a peroration. The slaves of either party to a suit might be tortured to elicit evidence, but such evidence was not admissible against their owners. Hadrian decreed that slaves should be tortured for evidence only as a last resort and under the strictest regulations, and he warned the courts that evidence secured by torture could never be trusted. Legal torture nevertheless persisted and was extended in the 3rd century to freemen. The jury voted by depositing marked tablets in an urn. A majority sufficed for a decision. In most cases, the loser might appeal to a higher court, and finally, if he could afford it, to the emperor. Penalties were fixed by law rather than left to the discretion of the judge. They varied with the rank of the offender, being severest for the slave. He might be crucified, the citizen might not. And no Roman citizen, as every reader of the Acts of the Apostles knows, could be scourged, tortured, or put to death over his appeal to the emperor. Different penalties were laid upon honestiores and humiliores for the same crime. They varied also according as the offender was freeborn or freeman, solvent or bankrupt, soldier or civilian. The simplest punishment was a fine. Since the value of currency changed more rapidly than the penalties named in the law, certain anomalies ensued. The 12 tables exacted a fine of 25 asses, originally 25 pounds of copper, for striking a freeman. When rising prices had lowered the ass to 6 cents, Lucius Voracious went about striking freemen in the face, followed by a slave who counted out 25 asses to each victim. Some offenses resulted in infamia, or speechlessness, chiefly the inability to appear, or be represented by another in an action at law. A more stringent punishment was loss of civic rights, capitis diminutio, which took the progressive forms of incapacity to inherit, deportation, and enslavement. Deportation was the harshest form of exile. The condemned man was put in chains, confined in some inhospitable place, and deprived of all his property. Exilium was milder in allowing the victim to live in freedom wherever he pleased outside of Italy. Relegatio, as in the case of Ovid, involved no confiscation but compelled the outcast to stay in a specified town, usually far from Rome. Imprisonment was seldom used as a permanent punishment, but men might be condemned to menial labor on public works, or in the mines or in the quarries of the state. Under the Republic, a freeman sentenced to death could escape the penalty by leaving Rome or Italy. Under the Empire, the death penalty was imposed with increasing frequency and ruthlessness. Prisoners of war, and in some cases other condemned men, might be thrown into the carcere Tullianum, to die of starvation, rodents, and lice in underground darkness and irremovable filth. There Jugurtha died, and Simon ben Giora, heroic defender of Jerusalem against Titus. There, said tradition, Peter and Paul had languished before their martyrdom, and had written their last addresses to the young Christian world. 6. The Law of the Nations. The most difficult problem of Roman law was to adjust itself as an intelligent master to the varied codes and customs of the lands that Roman arms or diplomacy had won. Many of these states were older than Rome. What they had lost in military courage they made up in proud traditions and a jealous fondness for their peculiar ways. Rome met the situation ably. A praetor peregrinus was appointed at first for the foreigners in Rome, then for Italy, then for the provinces, and power was given him to make some viable union between Roman and local law. The annual edicts of this praetor and the provincial governors and aediles gradually created the jus gentium, by which the empire was ruled. This law of the nations was not an international law, not a body of commitments accepted by the generality of states as governing their interrelations. In a sense not much more tenuous than today, there was in antiquity an international law, insofar as certain common customs were honored in peace and war, the mutual safeguarding of international merchants and diplomats, the granting of truce for the burial of the dead, abstention from the use of poisoned arrows, etc. The jurists of Rome, by a patriotic fiction, described the jus gentium as law common to all nations. But they were too modest about Rome's part in it. Actually, it was local law, adopted to Roman sovereignty, and designed to govern the peoples of Italy and the provinces without giving them Roman citizenship and the other rights of the jus civile. By a corresponding fiction, the philosophers attempted to identify the law of the nations with the law of nature. The Stoics defined the latter as a moral code implanted in man by natural reason. Nature, they held, was a system of reason, a logic and order in all things. This order, spontaneously developing in society and coming to consciousness in man, was natural law. Cicero phrased the fancy in a famous passage. True law is right reason in agreement with nature, worldwide in scope, unchanging, everlasting. We may not oppose or alter that law, we cannot abolish it, we cannot be freed from its obligations by any legislature, and we need not look outside ourselves for an expounder of it. This law does not differ for Rome and for Athens, for the present and for the future. It is and will be valid for all nations and all times. He who disobeys it denies himself and his own nature. It was a perfect statement of an ideal that grew in force as Stoicism reached the throne in the Antonines. Ulpian developed it into the far-reaching principle that class distinctions and privileges are accidental and artificial, and from this it was but a step to the Christian conception of all men as fundamentally equal. But when Gaius defined the jus gentium as simply the law which natural reason has established among all mankind, he was mistaking Roman arms for divine providence. Roman law was the logic and economy of force. The great codes of jus civile and jus gentium were the rules by which a wise conqueror gave order, regularity, and at times sanctity to a sovereignty based upon the legion's strength. They were natural, but only in the sense that it is natural for the strong to use and abuse the weak. Nevertheless, there is something noble in this imposing architecture of government called Roman law. Since the victor must rule, it is a boon that the rules of his mastery should be clearly expressed. In this sense, law is the consistency of power. It was natural that the Romans should create the greatest system of law in history. They loved order and had the means to enforce it. Upon the chaos of 100 diverse nations they laid an imperfect but sublime authority and peace. Other states had had laws, and legislators like Hammurabi and Solon had issued small bodies of humane legislation, but no people had yet achieved that immense coordination, unification, and codification which occupied the highest legal minds of Rome from the Scaevolas to Justinian. The flexibility of the jus gentium facilitated the transmission of Roman law to medieval and modern states. It was a happy accident that while the chaos of barbarian invasion was mutilating the legal heritage in the West, the Code, Digest, and Institutes of Justinian were collected and formulated in Constantinople, in the comparative security and continuity of the empire in the East. Through these labors and 100 lesser channels, and the silent tenacity of useful ways, Roman law entered into the canon law of the medieval church, inspired the thinkers of the Renaissance, and became the basic law of Italy, Spain, France, Germany, Hungary, Bohemia, Poland, even, within the British Empire, of Scotland, Quebec, Ceylon, and South Africa. English law itself, the only legal edifice of comparable scope, took its rules of equity, admiralty, guardianship, and bequests from Roman canon law. Greek science and philosophy, Judeo-Greek Christianity, Greco-Roman democracy, Roman law. These are our supreme inheritance from the ancient world. Chapter 19. The Philosopher Kings, A.D. 96 to 180. 1. Nerva. With the assassination of Domitian, the principle of heredity disappeared for a century from Roman monarchy. The Senate had never recognized inheritance as a source of sovereignty. Now, after 123 years of submission, it reasserted its authority. And as in Rome's beginnings it had chosen the king, now it named one of its own members princeps and imperator. It was an act of courage intelligible only when we remember that the vigor of the Flavian family was exhausted in that same generation which had seen the vitality of the Senate renewed by Italian and provincial blood. Marcus Cocceius Nerva was 66 when supremacy surprised him. The colossal Nerva of the Vatican shows a handsome and virile face. No one would suppose that this was a respectable jurist with a bad stomach, a mild and amiable poet who had once been hailed as the Tibullus of our time. Perhaps the Senate had chosen him for his gray harmlessness. He consulted it on all policies and kept his pledge never to be the cause of death to any of its members. He recalled Domitian's exiles, restored their property, and moderated their revenge. He distributed 60 million sesterces worth of lands among the poor, and established the alimenta, a state fund to encourage and finance parentage among the peasantry. He annulled many taxes, lowered the inheritance dues, and freed the Jews from the tribute that Vespasian had laid upon them. At the same time, he repaired the finances of the state by economy in his household and his government. With reason, he thought that he had been just to all classes, and remarked that, "I've done nothing that could prevent me from laying down the imperial office and returning to private life in safety." But a year after his accession, the Praetorian Guard, which had been forestalled in his nomination and resented his economy, besieged his palace, demanded the surrender of Domitian's assassins, and killed several of Nerva's counselors. He offered his throat to the swords of the soldiers, but they spared him. Humiliated, he wished to abdicate, but his friends persuaded him instead to return to Augustus's example and adopt as his son and successor a man acceptable to the Senate and capable of ruling not only the empire but the guard as well. The greatest debt that Rome owed Nerva was that he chose Marcus Ulpius Trajanus to succeed him. 3 months later, after a reign of 16 months, he passed away in 98. The principle of adoption, thus accidentally restored, meant that each emperor, as he felt his powers decline, would associate with himself in rule the ablest and fittest man he could find, so that when death came there would be neither the absurdity of a praetorian elevation, nor the risk of a natural but worthless heir, nor a civil war among competitors for the throne. It was a lucky chance that no son was born to Trajan, Hadrian, or Antoninus Pius, and that each could apply the adoptive plan without slighting his offspring or his own parental love. While the principle was maintained, it gave Rome the finest succession of good and great sovereigns the world has ever had. 2. Trajan. Trajan received word of his accession while he was in charge of a Roman army in Cologne. It was characteristic of him that he went on with his work at the frontier and postponed his coming to Rome for nearly 2 years. He had been born in Spain of an Italian family long settled there. In him and in Hadrian, Roman Spain arrived at political hegemony, as it had reached literary leadership in Seneca, Lucan, and Martial. He was the first in a long line of generals whose provincial birth and training seemed to give them the will to life that had gone from the native Roman stock. That Rome made no protest against this enthronement of a provincial was in itself an event and omen in Roman history. Trajan never ceased to be a general. His carriage was military, his presence commanding. His features were undistinguished but strong. Tall and robust, he was wont to march on foot with his troops and ford with full armament the 100 rivers they had to cross. His courage showed a stoic impartiality between life and death. Told that Licinius Sura was plotting against him, he went to Sura's house for dinner, ate without scrutiny whatever food was offered him, and had himself shaved by Sura's barber. He was not in any technical sense a philosopher. He used to take Dio Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed rhetor, with him in his chariot to discourse to him on philosophy, but he confessed that he could not understand a word of Dio's talk, the worse for philosophy. His mind was clear and direct. He uttered an amazing minimum of nonsense for a man. He was vain, like all human beings, but completely unassuming. He took no advantage of his office, joined his friends at table and the hunt, drank with them copiously, and indulged in occasional pederasty, as if out of deference to the customs of his time. Rome thought it worthy of praise that he never disturbed his wife Plotina by making love to another woman. When in the 42nd year of his age Trajan reached Rome, he was at the height of his faculties. His simplicity, geniality, and moderation readily won a people so lately acquainted with tyranny. The younger Pliny was chosen by the Senate to pronounce the panegyric of greeting. About the same time, Dio Chrysostom delivered before the emperor a discourse on the duties of a monarch as viewed by the Stoic philosophy. Both Pliny and Dio distinguished between dominatio and principatus. The prince was not to be lord of the state but its first servant, the executive delegate of the people, chosen through their representatives, the senators. Imperatorus omnibus elegi debet ex omnibus, said Pliny. He who is to command all should be elected by all. The general listened courteously. Such fair beginnings were not new in history. What astonished Rome was that Trajan fulfilled their promise abundantly. He gave to his aides or associates the villas in which his predecessors had stayed for a few weeks in the year. He regarded nothing as his own, said Pliny, unless his friends possessed it. As for himself, he lived as simply as Vespasian. He asked the Senate's opinion on all matters of moment, and discovered that he might wield nearly absolute power if he never used absolute speech. The Senate was willing to let him rule if he would observe the forms that maintained its dignity and prestige. Like the rest of Rome, it now loved security too much to be capable of freedom. Perhaps also it was pleased to find Trajan a conservative who had no intention of mulcting the rich to appease the poor. Trajan was an able and tireless administrator, a sound financier, a just judge. To him, the Digest of Justinian ascribes the principle, "It is better that the guilty should remain unpunished than that the innocent should be condemned." By careful supervision of expenditures and some lucrative conquests, he was able to complete extensive public works without increasing taxation. On the contrary, he lowered taxes and published a budget to expose the revenues and outlays of the government to examination and criticism. He required from the senators who enjoyed his comradeship an administrative devotion almost as meticulous as his own. The patricians entered the bureaucracy and worked as well as played. Trajan's extant correspondence with them suggests how carefully they labored under his watchful and inspiring leadership. Many of the eastern cities had mismanaged their finances to the point of bankruptcy, and Trajan sent curatores like the younger Pliny to help and check them. The procedure weakened municipal independence and institutions, but it was unavoidable. Self-government by extravagance and incompetence had brought its own end. Nurtured on war, the emperor was a frank imperialist who preferred order to liberty and power to peace. Hardly a year after his arrival in Rome, he set out for the conquest of Dacia. Roughly corresponding to the Romania of 1940, Dacia plunged like a fist into the heart of Germany and would therefore be of great military value in the struggle that Trajan foresaw between the Germans and Italy. Its annexation would give Rome control of the road that ran down the Save to the Danube and thence to Byzantium, an invaluable land route to the east. Besides, Dacia had gold mines. In a campaign brilliantly planned and swiftly executed, Trajan led his legions through all obstacles and resistance to the Dacian capital, Sarmizegetusa, and forced its surrender. A Roman sculptor has left us an impressive portrait of the Dacian king, Decebalus, a face noble with strength and character. Trajan reinstated him as a client king and returned to Rome in 102. But Decebalus soon broke his agreements and resumed his independent sway. Trajan marched his army back into Dacia in 105, bridged the Danube with a structure that was one of the engineering marvels of the century, and again stormed the Dacian capital. Decebalus was killed, a strong garrison was left to hold Sarmizegetusa, and Trajan went back to Rome to celebrate his victory with 10,000 gladiators, probably war captives, in 123 days of public games. Dacia became a Roman province, received Roman colonists, married them, and corrupted the Latin language in its own Romanian way. The gold mines of Transylvania were put under the direction of an imperial procurator, and soon paid for the material cost of the war. To reimburse himself for his labors, Trajan took out of Dacia 1,000,000 pounds of silver and 500,000 pounds of gold, the last substantial booty that the legions would win for Roman sloth. With these spoils, the emperor distributed 650 denarii, or $260, to all such citizens as applied for the gift, probably some 300,000, and enough remained to remedy the unemployment of demobilization with the greatest program of public works, governmental aid, and architectural adornment that Italy had seen since Augustus. Trajan improved the older aqueducts and built a new one which is still in operation. At Ostia, he constructed a spacious harbor connected by canals with the Tiber and the harbor of Claudius, and decorated it with warehouses that were models of beauty as well as of use. His engineers repaired old roads, carried a new one across the Pontine marshes, and laid the Via Traiana from Beneventum to Brundisium. They reopened the Claudian tunnel that had drained the Fucine lake, dredged harbors at Centum Celli and Ancona, gave Ravenna an aqueduct, and Verona an amphitheater. Trajan supplied the funds for new roads, bridges, and buildings throughout the empire, but he discouraged the architectural rivalry of the cities and urged them to spend their surplus on improving the condition and environment of the poor. He was always ready to help any city that had suffered from earthquake, fire, or storm. He tried to promote agriculture in Italy by requiring senators to invest a third of their capital in Italian land. And when he saw that this was extending the latifundia, he encouraged small proprietors by advancing them state funds at low interest for the purchase and improvement of their lands and homes. To raise the birth rate, he enlarged the alimenta, or feeding fund. The state made mortgage loans at 5%, half the usual rate, to Italian peasants, and allowed local charity boards to distribute the interest to poor parents at 16 sesterces, or $1.60 monthly, for each boy raised by them, and 12 for each girl. The sums seem small, but contemporary testimony indicates that from 16 to 20 sesterces sufficed for a month's care of a child on a first-century Italian farm. With a similar hope, Trajan allowed the children of Rome to receive the corn dole in addition to that given to their parents. The system of alimenta was enlarged by Hadrian and the Antonines, was extended to several parts of the empire, and was supplemented by private philanthropy. So the younger Pliny gave 30,000 sesterces a year as alimenta to the children of Comum, and Caelia Macrina left 1,000,000 to like purpose for the children of Terracina in Spain. Trajan, like Augustus, favored Italy over the provinces and Rome over Italy. He used to the full the architectural genius of Apollodorus, a Damascene Greek who had designed the new roads and aqueduct, and the Danube Bridge. The emperor now commissioned him to clear away large blocks of houses, cut 130 feet from the base of the Quirinal Hill, lay out in this and the adjoining space a new forum equal in area to all preceding forums combined, and surround it with buildings of a majesty fit for a world capital that had reached the height of its power and opulence. The Forum Trajanum was entered through the triumphal arch of Trajan. The interior, 370 by 354 feet, was paved with smooth stone and surrounded by a high wall and portico. East and west walls were indented with hemicycle exedrae formed of Doric columns. In the center rose the Basilica Ulpia, named after Trajan's clan and intended as an office building for commerce and finance. Its exterior was adorned with 50 monolithic columns, its floor was of marble, its immense nave was enclosed by granite colonnades, its roof of massive beams was covered with bronze. Near the northern end of the new forum 2 libraries were built, one for Latin works, the other for Greek. Between them rose the column, behind them the temple, of Trajan. When the forum was complete, it was accounted one of the architectural wonders of the world. The column, still standing, was first of all an achievement in transportation. It was cut from 18 cubes of marble, each weighing some 50 tons. The blocks were brought by ship from the island of Paros, were transferred to barges at Ostia, were drawn against the current up the river, and were moved on rollers up the bank and through the streets to their site. The cubes were recut into 32 blocks. 8 formed the pedestal, 3 sides of this were decorated with sculptures, the 4th opened into a spiral stairway of 185 marble steps. The shaft, 12 feet in diameter at the bottom and 97 feet high, was composed of 21 blocks and was topped by a statue of Trajan holding a globe of the world. Before being raised into position, the blocks were carved with reliefs picturing the campaigns in Dacia. These reliefs are the culmination of Flavian realism and of ancient historical sculpture. They do not aim at the calm beauty or idealized types of Greek sculpture. They seek rather to convey a vivid impression of living individuals in the actual scenes and turmoil of war. They are Balzac and Zola after Corneille and Racine. In the 2,000 figures of these 124 spiral panels, we follow the conquest of Dacia step by step, the Roman cohorts issuing from their stations in full armor, the crossing of the Danube on a pontoon bridge, the pitching of a Roman camp in the enemy's land, the confused conflict of spears, arrows, sickles, and stones, a Dacian village set to the torch with women and children begging Trajan for mercy, Dacian women torturing Roman prisoners, soldiers displaying before the emperor the heads of slain enemies, surgeons treating the wounded, the Dacian princes drinking one after another the cup of poison, the head of Decebalus brought as a trophy to Trajan, the long file of captive men, women, and children snatched from their homes into foreign settlement or Roman slavery. This and more the dark column tells in the most masterly narrative relief in sculptural history. These artists and their employers were not chauvinists. They showed Trajan's acts of clemency, but also they revealed the heroic aspects of a nation's struggle for freedom. And the finest figure in the scroll is the Dacian king. It is a strange document, too crowded for full effectiveness, some figures so crude that one wonders if a Dacian warrior carved them, superposition primitively substituted for perspective, and the whole observable like Phidias's frieze only by some skylark scorner of the ground. But it was an interesting deviation from a classic style whose placidity had never expressed the overwhelming energy of the Roman character. Its method of continuity, making each scene melt into the next, carried on the suggestions of Titus's arch and prepared for medieval reliefs. Despite its defects, the spiral story was imitated again and again, from the column of Aurelius in Rome and that of Arcadius in Constantinople to the Napoleonic shaft in the Place Vendôme in Paris. Trajan completed his building program by finishing in the grand manner the baths begun by Domitian. Meanwhile, 6 years of peace had wearied him. Administration was a task that did not awaken his reserve energies as war did. He did not feel alive in a palace. Why not take up Caesar's plans where Antony had failed, settle the Parthian question once and for all, establish a more strategic frontier in the east, and capture control of the trade routes across Armenia and Parthia to Central Asia, the Persian Gulf, and India? After careful preparation, he set out again with his legions in 113. A year later he had taken Armenia, yet another year and he had marched down through Mesopotamia, captured Ctesiphon, and reached the Indian Ocean, the first and last Roman general to stand before that sea. The population at home learned geography by following his victories. The Senate was amused to be informed almost weekly of another nation conquered or hastily submitting. The Bosporus, Caucasus, Asiatic Iberia, Asiatic Albania, Osrhoene, Messenia, Media, Assyria, Arabia Petria, at last even Parthia. Parthia, Armenia, Assyria, and Mesopotamia were constituted provinces, and the new Alexander had the glory of naming and crowning a client king over the ancient enemies of Rome. Standing on the shores of the Red Sea, Trajan mourned that he was too old to repeat the Macedonians' advance to the Indus. He contented himself with building a Red Sea fleet to control the passage and commerce to India, left garrisons at all strategic points, and turned back reluctantly toward Rome. Like Antony, he had gone too fast and too far, and had neglected to consolidate his victories and his lines. On reaching Antioch, he was informed that the Parthian king Osroes, whom he had deposed, had gathered another army and had reconquered central Mesopotamia, that rebellion had broken out in all the new provinces, that the Jews of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Cyrene were in revolt, and that disaffection was flaring up in Libya, Mauritania, and Britain. The old warrior wished to take the field again, but his flesh refused. He had worn himself out by living as actively in the hot East as in the West. Dropsy set in, and a paralytic stroke left the great will helpless in a broken frame. Sadly, he commissioned Lucius Quietus to put down the uprisings in Mesopotamia, sent Marcius Turba to suppress the Jews in Africa, and left his nephew Hadrian in command of the main Roman army in Syria. He had himself carried down to the Cilician coast, hoping to sail thence to Rome, where the Senate was preparing for him the greatest triumph since Augustus. He died at Selinus on the way in 117, aged 64, after a reign of 19 years. His ashes were taken to the Capitol and were buried under the great column that he had chosen as his tomb. 3. Hadrian. 1. The ruler. Probably we shall never know whether the most brilliant of the Roman emperors won his throne by amorous connivance or by Trajan's conviction of his worth. His appointment, says Dio Cassius, was due to the fact that when Trajan died without an heir, his widow, Plotina, who was in love with Hadrian, conspired to secure him the succession. Spartianus repeats the story. Plotina and Hadrian denied the rumor, which nevertheless persisted to the end of his reign. He settled the matter by distributing a generous donative among the troops. Publius Aelius Hadrianus traced his cognomen and his family to the town of Adria, on the Adriatic coast. Thence, said his autobiography, his ancestors had migrated to Spain. The same Spanish town, Italica, that had seen the birth of Trajan in 52, saw that of his nephew Hadrian in 76. When the boy's father died in 86, he was placed under the guardianship of Trajan and Caelius Attianus. The latter tutored him and instilled in him so warm a fondness for Greek literature that the youth was nicknamed Greeculus. He studied also singing, music, medicine, mathematics, painting, and sculpture, and later dabbled in half a dozen arts. Trajan called him to Rome in 91 and gave him his niece in marriage, this in 100. Vivia Sabina, as preserved in portrait busts that may have idealized her, was a woman of distinguished and conscious beauty, in whom Hadrian found no lasting happiness. Possibly he loved dogs and horses too keenly, and spent too much time hunting with them and building tombs for them when they died. Perhaps he was unfaithful, or seemed so. In any case, she bore him no children, and though she accompanied him on many of his travels, they lived in lifelong estrangement. He showed her every favor and courtesy, and gave her every kindness but affection. When Suetonius, one of his secretaries, spoke disrespectfully of her, he dismissed him. Hadrian's first decision as emperor was to revise the imperialistic policy of his uncle. He had counseled Trajan against the Parthian expedition as too great an expenditure of men and means so soon after the Dacian wars, and as promising at best gains difficult to hold. And Trajan's generals, eager for glory, had never pardoned his opposition. Now he withdrew the legions from Armenia, Assyria, Mesopotamia, and Parthia, made Armenia a client kingdom instead of a province, and accepted the Euphrates as the eastern boundary of the empire. He played Augustus to Trajan's Caesar, and consolidated with peaceful administration as much as he could of the unprecedented realm that reckless arms had won. The generals who had led Trajan's forces, Palma, Celsus, Quietus, Nigrinus, thought this policy cowardly and unwise. To cease to attack, they felt, was merely to defend, and merely to defend was to begin to die. While Hadrian was with his legions on the Danube, the Senate announced that the 4 generals had been detected in a conspiracy to overthrow the government and had been executed by the Senate's orders. Rome was shocked to find that the men had received no trial, and though Hadrian, returning hurriedly to Rome, protested that he had had nothing to do with the matter, no one believed him. He vowed to put no senator to death except at the Senate's bidding, distributed a gift of money among the people, amused them with abundant games, cancelled tax arrears to the amount of 900 million sesterces, publicly burned the tax records in a fiscal auto da fe, and for 20 years governed with wisdom, justice, and peace. But his unpopularity remained complete. His ancient biographer describes him as tall and elegant, with hair curled, and a full beard to hide the natural blemishes of his face. Thenceforth all Rome wore beards. He was strongly built and kept himself in vigor by frequent exercise, above all by hunting. On several occasions he killed a lion with his own hands. So many elements were mingled in him that description is baffled. We are told that he was stern and cheerful, humorous and grave, sensual and cautious, hard and liberal, severe and merciful, deceptively simple, and always in all things various. He had a quick, impartial, skeptical, and penetrating mind, but he respected tradition as the connective tissue of generations. He read and admired the Stoic Epictetus, but he sought pleasure with shamelessness and taste. He was irreligious and superstitious, laughed at oracles, played with magic and astrology, encouraged the national faith, and sedulously performed the duties of Pontifex Maximus. He was courteous and obstinate, sometimes cruel, usually kind. Perhaps his contradictions were merely adaptations to circumstance. He visited the sick, helped the unfortunate, extended existing charities to orphans and widows, and was a generous patron to artists, writers, and philosophers. He was a good singer, dancer, and harpist, a competent painter, a middling sculptor. He wrote several volumes, a grammar, an autobiography, poems, decent and indecent, in Latin and Greek. He preferred Greek to Latin literature, and old Cato's simple Latin to Cicero's smooth eloquence. Under his example, many authors now affected an archaic style. He organized the state-paid professors into a university, paid them well, and built for them a magnificent Athenaeum to rival the Museum of Alexandria. It delighted him to gather scholars and thinkers about him, to puzzle them with questions and laugh at their contradictions and disputes. Favorinus of Gaul was the wisest of this philosophic court. When his friends rallied him for yielding to Hadrian in argument, he answered that any man with 30 legions behind him must be right. Along with these multiple intellectual interests went an unerring sense for the practical. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.